So welcome everybody to this Computing System Week seminar. My name is Mark Duranton and I will be your host today. So today is our pleasure to host Gaël Blondelle from the Eclipse Foundation. So Gaël joined the Eclipse Foundation in 2013, where he is now managing director of Eclipse Foundation Europe and vice president ecosystem development of the Eclipse Foundation. So Gaël joined the Eclipse Foundation with the desire to help organizations to work in open source as the best way to implement open innovation and open cooperation. So Gaël, so now the floor is yours. So tell us about the Eclipse Foundation and Open Source Europe's opportunity for global impact.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thank you very much for the invitation. I remember that was sometimes around exactly 1 year ago when we had this one-day webinar about open source. And I come back to that because it's personally that was a very good experience, and I'm very happy to be here again today. So yeah, you said already what I'm doing now. One thing that I would like to say again is that I have been involved in open source since 2004, so that's more than 16 years now, and in different roles. So I started as an entrepreneur, when I created my own company, and we were building open source middleware. I was at that time involved in OW2, which is a European open source foundation, and then I started to be some kind of an ecosystem manager as a project leader of the OPs project, and which is an ITO project, and that's where I get this help more organizations do more open source. I will discuss a bit about business models later. But just to be clear, I think that it's really important that we manage to do more open source together, but it's also okay to do business around open source projects. And as I start with mentioning the Eclipse Foundation, I would like to break the ice with telling you that, okay, I will not be talking about the Eclipse development tools. So yes, the Eclipse Foundation started a long time ago to support the community around the Eclipse IDE and the Eclipse development tool. But my talk today is really about collaborating in open source and the good characteristic of open source to enable collaborations. And so if there are Emacs users, VI users, VS Code users, etc., no problem. We like you too. That's very important to understand that the Eclipse Foundation, at least since 2010, is a general purpose, what we call an umbrella open source foundation, and we host lots of open source projects in various topics. So that includes development tools, of course, but also cloud technologies, IoT and edge technologies. We also have AI technologies, and we do a lot also, especially in Europe, around automotive. And as you can see on this slide, we recently finalized our move to Europe. And what do we mean by this move to Europe? It's really the fact that in 2004, when the Eclipse Foundation was created, it was created as a 501c6 organization in Delaware, like lots of other open source foundations. But some I would say two years ago, we realized that 2/3 of our community and 2/3 of our supporter organizations were based in Europe, and so that's really that over time we managed to really grow in Europe, and this move to Europe is really for us also a way to align our corporate structure with our ecosystem. And since we finalized this move to Europe, we are certainly the largest open source foundation in Europe. And one thing that is important, in my opinion, is that we are fully operating under European law, and we are also hosting code on our GitLab servers in Europe. So, and finally, if you look at it, we have that's the list of companies that are part of the board of directors of the Eclipse Foundation. And and if you look at it, we have the majority of European organizations in our board of directors. And I think that our board of directors is certainly the only board of directors of a large international open source foundation with a majority and a large majority of European citizens at the board. So let's say a few things about open source. I think you all know a bit about open source, but restarting from the basics is sometimes really useful to just to set the scene. So yes, we can say that open source is eating the world, and you know, that's this saying from Mark Andreessen in 2011 that software is eating the world, and now we can certainly say that open source is eating the world. In terms of usage, there are studies from Gartner and Forrester who say that around 80 to 90% of software developers use open source components in their application. And I think that more specifically in your ecosystem, I would say that's mostly, I would bet that this is about 100% of developers are using open source components in the HiPEAC ecosystem. But beyond that, there are also studies saying that adoption of open source, and even more the contribution to open source, gives a huge advantage to an organization. That's, in my opinion, that's really cool. Also because, you know, business people read what McKinsey and the Harvard Business School say. So that means that when those organizations start talking about open source and studying the dynamics of open source, then it's really important for our ecosystem at large. But another important aspect of open source is that in the last few years, there has been a shift about the kind of open source that we see. I remember when I started to work on open source, that was sometimes around 2003. I was working for France Telecom at that time. And we were definitely in this open source commoditization approach that was really about using cheaper operating systems, allowing to use cheaper hardware, and to continue to operate the information system on such platforms. But more recently, we moved from this commoditization approach, where the goal is really about reducing the cost, to a more innovative approach. And if you think about it, recently all innovations have come very quickly, if not from the beginning, with open source platforms to push those innovations. That's true in big data. That's true with the cloud. That is definitely enabled by open source. That's also true with artificial intelligence, etc. And so that's where we say that open source can be a strategic enabler. The problem we have for the moment is that most companies are here. They are just in this situation where they know how to use open source, but also if you talk to companies, it's likely that they start to approach open source as a compliance issue. So their main focus is, okay, what do we need to do legally to avoid being in trouble because our developers use open source? So when they realize that their developers use open source and potentially will embed open source components and libraries in their products, and then they redistribute open source, then they realize that, okay, we may have some legal issues if we don't properly manage this inbound open source components. I think that your ecosystem is a bit different. I think that most of you are certainly already in the good in the contribution part. So, and by contribution part, I mean you have people who are already committers in open source projects. You have potentially people who already created some open source projects and are releasing their software in open source. I guess that most of you have a GitHub account or something like that. And that's really cool. But what I want to address today, and that will be the second part of my talk, is how can we collectively move to this leadership part, and how can we use open source as really a strategic enabler? But let's get back to some of the basics. So open source is intellectual property management. So maybe from a developer point of view, maybe from a researcher point of view, open source is just exchanging on mailing list and communicating with other developers and doing stuff together with other developers. But basically, open source exists because there are open source licenses. And open source licenses, it's really doing intellectual property management. So at some point, the developers, your team, your lab, your department, your organization decides to publish intellectual property under a well-known license. And this aspect that the license is well-known is very important. So because that's one of the main characteristics of open source, is that there are too many licenses, but if you look at it, there are something like 10 licenses that everybody is using. And if you look at those 10 licenses, if you choose one of them and publish your software under one of those very well-known and well-adopted licenses, then you can be certain that everywhere in the world, everybody understands what was your intention in publishing your project and how to collaborate with you according to those intentions. One thing maybe is that free software and open source are mostly the same thing. And when I talk about the most used licenses, it's likely that they are free software license and open source licenses at the same time. And there is only one definition of free software since 1984, which is the capability, the freedom to run the program, to study the program, to redistribute copies, and also to modify and redistribute copies of the modified work. And that's really important. And open source is to some extent a marketing campaign to help promote the concept of free software without the problem of the fact that free has different meanings in English. But maybe you are not aware of that. But there are some companies and also some activists we want to redefine open source to restrict the domain of application. One classical aspect is that, okay, I want to publish my software in open source, but I want to limit the capabilities that cloud providers can use this software to make money with my software without giving back to me. And I think that trying to change that at the licensing level or at the definition level of what is free software and what is open source is not the right approach. And I come back later to what kind of approaches we can take, but there are good legal and practical reasons to stick to the current definition and to the current openness of open source and free software. One thing about the ecosystem, the larger open source ecosystem. Foundations, open source foundations have a very special role in the ecosystem. And at the Eclipse Foundation, for example, our role is really to enable sustainable, vendor-neutral, and open collaboration. And all the words are important here. Sustainability, it's in our bylaws, it's in our mission. Our mission is to ensure the sustainability of our open source projects. Vendor neutrality, that's deeply integrated in all the processes of an open source foundation, and really our core value proposition. And this sustainability is very important for users of the technology. Vendor neutrality is also very important, and that's what enables open collaboration. Because there are several flavors of open source. Yeah, there is just publishing code on GitHub or GitLab, and that's fine. That can be interesting. If the code is a research prototype or something like that, then that may be good enough to just put a license on the code and publish it, and then okay, it's available, it's open source, it will even be archived by something like Software Heritage, for example. But from a developer point of view, that's also you can see in your GitHub profile, you can see how many contributions you have done, etc. So that's something like your CV as a software developer on GitHub. But to some extent, I think that a platform like GitHub or GitLab is just a collaboration platform. So that enables community that can host very good quality code. But then you're missing all the non-code aspect of open source. And all the non-code aspects of open source, it's all the processes to make sure that what you do is open and transparent. I come back to that. How to ensure vendor neutrality, how to properly manage intellectual property. And this is the kind of things that we provide as an open source foundation. One special case is single vendor open source. And I think that you have heard in the news that we have more and more companies that start as single vendor open source. So they publish their part of their product in open source, and that's what's called this open core model. I come back to that later. But the problem with single vendor open source is that even if they do a good stuff in developing an ecosystem and marketing the product and so getting large adoption, at some point they always make sure that they have all the intellectual property of the source code. And why do they do that? Because that gives them the freedom to change their licensing model. So when I was talking about sustainability before, this model is not really sustainable. because if you think about MongoDB, Redis, Grafana that announced 2 weeks ago that they moved from Apache software license to Affero GPL, that the question to some extent is not if a single vendor open source will change their model, but the question is when will they change their model? So there's really a big difference between single vendor open source and a company that is leading a project in the context of an open source foundation. That's where you move from something that can be cool, that can be interesting to use and to reuse, to something that is not only cool, but also sustainable. And this, in terms of implementation, when I talk about governance and project governance principles, that in our projects, that really is about 3 main principles. The 3 main principles are transparency, openness, and meritocracy. And by transparency, we mean that every decision that happens in an open source project should be public. So you can have a meeting. That's not a problem to have a meeting. That's not a problem if you are in the same team to have discussions at the office when we can go to the office. But the point in transparency is that if you take a decision, then your decision should be written on the mailing list, on a wiki page, or in an issue of the project, because that's what enables external people to really understand what you are doing and why you are doing it. And this transparency is what enables them to start contributing to your project if they want to. And when you receive contributions, that's when openness is important. Openness means that everybody can participate in a project, and that's really the fact that you don't want to restrict the participation in your project. You really want to embrace the community at large, because that's also at some point the diversity of the community that ensures the sustainability of the project. And the last one is meritocracy. It's that a good practice in open source project is that everybody has to start as a contributor, and at some point after several contributions, they can be elected by the existing committers of the project. So that's really the 3 main governance principles that if you think about the Apache Software Foundation, they apply that. The Eclipse Foundation, we also apply those principles. The Linux Foundation also do that. So that's really not a fancy approach. That's really good implementation of best practices for open source collaboration. And I said earlier that at the Eclipse Foundation, we think it's okay to do business, and I would say that all our framework is oriented towards enabling business for our members and for the larger ecosystem. And that's where we have this business-friendly ecosystem that is based on extensible platforms. So that relies on several services. So a collaboration infrastructure, governance and processes, community development, and IP management, which is basically the usual services provided by an open source foundation. And everything is set up to enable collaboration on open source platforms, even between competitors, but also to enable the creation of products and services on top of this platform. And in a minute, we will discuss examples of open source business models, but that's really typically I would not say that there is a relation between the open source license you choose and the kind of business models you have to implement. because we will see that you can have very successful business models with GPL, and you can also have very successful business models with Apache license, for example. But at the Eclipse Foundation, since the beginning, we have created the Eclipse Public License, which is a very good license to enable this collaboration on open source platform, because the goal of the Eclipse Public License is that you take the platform, you can reuse it in your product, and by product, I mean including in your proprietary product. But if you change anything in the platform, you have to publish back your changes in the open source platform. So that's really about fostering collaboration on the platform and enabling the creation of products and various business models on top of the platform. And just so you know, I mentioned the Eclipse Public License because we think that it's a good license. But in our project, by default, we accept MIT, BSD, Apache, and we are also open to other licensing schemes if there is a good reason for that. So let's look at a few open source business models. So at the beginning, I mentioned that I used to be working in the OPS project. And OPS was a project with Airbus, CA, Thales, Ericsson, and 28 partners in total. And one of the topic was to formalize business models, and that's something we did in 2012, I think, but it's still valid in terms of the result. So I think that some of you know this business model canvas. So the idea is that on one page you put everything about a business model. So there's the value proposition aspect. That's who are the customers and how do you manage the relationship to your customers? What are the key activities and key resources to deliver your value proposition? And who are the key partners that help you in doing that? And here you have the cost structure and the revenue stream. So there are let's go quickly over several open source business models. One of the business model is pure service business model, and basically that's something you observe with freelance consultants or also some system integrators, that they will spend time to be visible, to contribute to the communities, and they will use those open source communities to reach out to their customers and to show their expertise in the domain. And that's something that works pretty well. And there is the same business model, but with some additional elements to it. It's that in addition to promoting your expertise, it's really showing expertise by creating open source projects and by promoting open source prototypes in the context of those open source communities or on GitHub typically. So that means that you start having an R&D team, and we have plenty of SMEs in Europe that do that, especially also some of them in the context of European research projects. And that's an interesting business model. Then the next one is what we called almost 10 years ago, the leverage service business model, and what people would call open core now. And basically, that's really about selling products, selling supporting products, and the revenue then comes from recurring subscription contracts or licensing, pure licensing revenue. And one of the key activities here is product management and QA, because of course, that's the difference between an open source project and a product, is that you need to do more QA, and you need to also package the product. And product management, it's really this idea that, okay, you need to decide what features should be in the open source platform and what features should be in your product. And I think that there are good rules to decide that. I mean that the open source platform should be usable. If it's not very usable, if it doesn't bring enough value, then it will not be a successful platform. So it's likely that your product based on this platform will not be successful as well. So that's really about using the open source platform for adoption, but also I think that it's perfectly fine to have some proprietary features that are based on top of this open source platform. And that's the proprietary features is what you sell to some extent in this business model. One example of the leverage service business model is Red Hat, and I really like this snapshot from their website, because that's really what it is about. That's they have another presentation that they deliver to new employees at Red Hat that says that, okay, if you look at it, Linux, it's 50,000 packages, and Fedora is 5,000 packages. And when you buy Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you get 1,500 packages plus security patches plus long-term support, etc. So that's really this tried, tested, and trusted. But that works because Linux is a very complex ecosystem. That doesn't necessarily work everywhere. So that's an interesting example, but I think that maybe other organizations would rather be more successful if they just get a simpler approach and create a product on top of an open source platform. Just a few words about the business model of an open source foundation. So I already told you that our value proposition is about governance, intellectual property management, creation of ecosystems, and also providing a collaboration infrastructure. And one of the key activities is really community management. It's really not only managing the community of each project, but also we have 400 active projects, and that's really also connecting people between the different projects. And we have good success stories of small and larger companies that say, hey, yes, that's cool. We came to the Eclipse ecosystem in the IoT and Edge working group, for example, and we didn't know each other before, but now we have set up a collaboration. And the revenue is just membership fees. So I think that 95% of our revenue comes from the fact that companies that participate in the Eclipse ecosystem pay a yearly fee to be part of this ecosystem. So that's an interesting context. And now, what about a strategic approach to open source? So the idea is let's try to have a dream together about what we can do together in your ecosystem, and also at the European scale to use open source as a tool for leadership. So if you look at it, we know, and I'm sorry if that's not new, but European companies are not the leaders in the platform economy. But I think that our innovation ecosystem creates lots of the great technologies that have enabled this platform economy. So I think that the idea, if we want to play a more prominent role in this global platform economy, is really to be able to join forces, but not only between European organizations, but at the global scale. And I think that open source is a good strategy for that. And that's really what Stefan Evers from Bosch open source team try to say in this slide. That's really that open source is the framework to create swarms of and become competitive against the big fishes. And how does it happen? And that's really through another business model. And this other business model is the co-creation of open source extensible platforms. I think that, again, here, all the words are important. That's really co-creation is important, that we manage to do that together. The fact that we create platforms, that they must be extensible, and that they have to use open source to create this community. And so the value proposition here is that, okay, you publish a game-changing technology, and well, sometimes it's not easy, because if you think it's a game-changing technology, there's then the temptation to keep it close and to resell it, etc., is certainly huge. But publishing a game-changing technology in open source can be very powerful. Of course, what we need is to be successful with that is a large labs workforce. It's also technology leaders, and there's really this question of extensible platform. And one of the main advantages of that is that we reduce the platform cost. And by reducing the platform cost, of course, we enable more business to be built on top of that. And I'm sorry, but one of the examples that I know better to explain this, and there are plenty of other examples, is when IBM decided to create Eclipse. So I know that we are back 20 years ago, because this year we will celebrate the 20 years of the Eclipse IDE. But this photo is a photo of John Svensson, who was the head of the tools group at IBM in 2001 when they open sourced the Eclipse IDE. And during a keynote at EclipseCon Europe in 2011, he told us a story about why did IBM create Eclipse, the Eclipse IDE. And basically, the main reason was that at that time, Microsoft was doing very well with software development tools, with Visual Studio, etc. And there was a risk that if developers adopt Visual Studio, then they will develop in Visual C++, and then they will potentially develop more likely for Windows servers. And that was, and in parallel to that, IBM had really a lot of platforms and different languages. So they had Windows, they had OS2, they had AIX, they had AS400. And if you look at it, in the last few years of the 90s, they took several decisions. So they started to support Linux. They selected Java as their overall application platform, and they created Eclipse. And when they created Eclipse, they decided to create Eclipse as an open source platform, and that really changed the market. Like, potentially, some companies were doing lots of money on basic development tools before, but after Eclipse, it was to some extent not possible anymore. So open source was used in this context as a disruptive strategy. And the key with open source is really adoption. So if you want to do open source, if you push your code to GitHub, but if you don't really work to get adoption, then, well, to some extent, you get the trouble without getting the benefit. And why do developers want open source? Because that's you can innovate without asking anybody. You can experiment just by you download the project and you start experimenting. And you also can innovate through integration. So that's really this idea that you have open source components, and when you put together the open source components, you must have something like 80 to 90% of your final solution. And that's really integrating components and building the thin layer of unique value proposition on top of the open source platform. One thing to keep in mind is that developers like open source because it's available, but companies want governance. And I think that there's really something to keep in mind here, is that researchers should think when you publish open source, you should keep in mind this idea that, okay, at some point, if you want adoption by large organizations, then you need to have a strict governance. And then also, to some extent, I'm sorry to say that, but you certainly need to use a permissive license, because big companies are more likely to use a permissive license. I don't say that it's impossible to have companies using strong copyleft licenses. Of course, they do it, but I think that except in the Linux ecosystem, they don't do it so often. So let's talk about the opportunity. The open source opportunity is really relies in the fact that now innovation tends to appear in open source from the beginning. You can see tons of IoT and edge computing platforms that are open source. The same for AI and machine learning. Same for cloud, distributed ledger technologies, etc. And one thing is, of course, when you are in an ecosystem where you need lots of scalability, like cloud or IoT, then of course open source is a good implementation strategy, because then you can scale without having to pay some royalties for every new device. And I think that even if we would like to have royalties on every device, it's likely that more and more solutions will use open source when there is a lot of scalability. And there is this machine economy opportunity that IoT we will have tons, billions of connected devices. And we are at the moment when this platform is being built. And so the next generation platform is the platform of the machine economy. And it's likely that this platform will be open source. And the question is, who will build it? And I think that we have everything we need in Europe to be able to build it. A few things. That's something we did with a colleague 2 weeks ago for the NG IoT CSA, and they invited us to one of their webinars, and we prepared this specific version of this matrix. And this is in this matrix, we put the project we have in mind on the edge ops domain, and in color that's Eclipse project, in gray that's project in hosted at other places like the Open Infrastructure Foundation or the Linux Foundation. And we also added a small European flag on the project we think are mainly developed in Europe. So that's easier in the project we host because we know where our community is based. But we also know, for example, that OpenHab is developed in Europe. We all know that Mano, which is driven by Etsy, is developed in Europe. So I think that we already have several interesting projects. There's nothing preventing from building on top of other projects that are already there as in open source, like using Kubernetes or OpenStack or other projects to create other platforms and to really have the European leadership on other platforms. Of course, we should do that. I will come back to this idea of not reinventing the wheel. Also, I wanted to mention the Open Hardware Group because at the Eclipse Foundation, we have a strong partnership with the Open Hardware Group. And I see in your vision document that you mentioned RISC-V. So we host the Open Hardware Group project, and we are the operator of the Open Hardware Group. So the Open Hardware Group is a separate organization, but we have a partnership where all the members of the Open Hardware Group are members of the Eclipse Foundation, and we provide all the back office and all our services to support the Open Hardware Group. And yeah, I'm coming to my conclusion. And so, well, I mentioned the webinar we had last year about open source, and I'm really happy that to see this recommendation in the vision document. That's, in my opinion, that's really amazing because unfortunately, I would say that I'm sometimes a bit disappointed that in various strategic research agendas, sometimes software is not enough mentioned, and open source is sometimes not mentioned at all. So thank you so much for mentioning it. There are a few things that attract my attention when I read this recommendation. Is RISC-V. So I just talked about the Open Hardware Group, so you know why this attracts my attention. Also, the recommendation to invest in free open source digital communities in the form of an EU platform. I think that's very important, and we fully agree about that. And I have a few recommendations about how to implement this. And there is this one. This part I'm not necessarily, I don't necessarily agree completely with it, but I come back to that. So there are a few recommendations I would like to make. First one is don't reinvent the wheel. I know in research, a part of the goal is to reinvent the wheel, but I have seen several research projects that even when there is a follow-up project, the team decide that, okay, we should restart what we have done the previous time. So in the first project, they have managed to publish some results in open source, but in the next follow-up project, sometimes they restart from scratch. And so I think that doing more research related to open source, the new research project should really use, extend, or adapt existing open source platforms. And sometimes there is a good reason to create a new open source platform from scratch. I think that, for example, RISC-V, there was obvious reasons of creating RISC-V because they needed something that was patent-free and that would really be fully open source. So intellectual property constraints or licensing constraints can be a good reason to create a new open source platform. Some technical constraints can also be a good reason to create a new open source platform. But I think that the default approach should be to talk to existing projects and to try to really set up a collaboration with those existing projects. And that's really related to this one, which is that we certainly need to grow a few sustainable existing platforms. And when you say that we need to create an EU platform, again, just don't start from scratch. The main topic here is trying to be sustainable, trying to have an extensible architecture, because that's a requirement for success, and really trying to have a few complementary research projects collaborating on the same platform. And then there are certainly two different streams. There is one stream of the platform that is for industry. So one stream where you maybe restrict the number of features, but you want to raise the technology readiness level. And another stream is for research, where you of course you are more on the bleeding edge of innovation on this stream. Another thing is that open source starts with code, but it's more than code. So open source governance is important. Open source IP management is also important. Community development is something that is very important. And I think that there should be experts involved in the various projects on those specific topics, to avoid the pitfalls of what I call a naive approach to open source. And what I mean by a naive approach to open source is that, okay, let's just push our code on GitHub and that will be okay for the review. We have seen that so many times, and I think that it's not good. It's not good for anybody. And that brings me to this. This is a slide from our corporate presentation, and that's really we like to say that at the Eclipse Foundation we are the community for open innovation and collaboration, and that we are community driven, code first, and commercial friendly. And this code first topic is very important in my opinion. That's really code first, and anything else comes after. That can be marketing, etc. But still, being publishing code and managing a community and being commercial friendly, that's what we like. And I said that in your recommendation, there is this idea of creating a new open source institution. Just a hint, that's a very long process that requires lots of money, because you cannot imagine how much we pay to lawyers to create a legal framework that is compelling for large organizations and also open to smaller organizations and research organizations. And actually, the chances of success are not so big, and we are happy to help. So just a few numbers. So typically, we are close now, I think, to 300,000 subscribers to our newsletter. We organize an event a week. We have millions of visitors, and that's really, this kind of stuff is really the result of working hard and for a long time on this open source reputation and visibility. And before we started, we were talking with Mark about the fact that I'm the managing director of the Eclipse Foundation Europe GmbH. So we have participated in research projects for a long time. And we think that this idea of having open source as a research catalyst between SMEs, industries, and researchers, we think that it's really something that can be easily implemented. So that's a research project where we have been a partner since 2013, I think, or 2014. And you can see that we have Horizon 2020, ITER, Excel, and also some German funded projects in lots of the different domains. And yeah, we are happy when we can help research projects, and we can be a partner in those research projects. That's not mandatory, but if you think that it's a good idea, we will be happy to work with you and to tell you more about what we do in this context. Some free advices to make your life easier with open source is to properly manage intellectual property. Like if you have students or PhDs or even interns working on a project, then, well, you need to get their copyright or in order to have the choice about how to do stuff in open source in the future. Don't do open source intellectual property management alone. Potentially, your technology transfer team is used to it. Potentially, they don't like open source. So if they don't like open source, maybe we can organize a meeting with them and hopefully we manage to convince them. Don't reinvent the wheel, because there are already so many wheels available in open source that it's not necessary to reinvent a lot. And choose a business-friendly license. That may be not your personal choice, but I think that in terms of dissemination, exploitation, etc., that's certainly your best chance to get adoption by large organizations. And finally, an open source project is like a puppy. So that's cool, that's cute, but it requires a lot of attention if you want to get the rewards you expect. And that's my conclusion. Thank you.
So thank you again, and well, see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.